Welcome to Crypto Disrupted, a cryptocurrency and blockchain podcast with your hosts, Trent Lipinski and Greg Kerr.
All right, welcome to another episode of Crypto Disrupted. I'm Greg Kerr, and this is Trent Lipinski. And we have a special guest with us today, Roger Haenni from Datum, calling in all the way from Hong Kong. So welcome, Roger, and tell us about yourself and a little bit about what you're doing.
Sure. Hi, guys. Thanks for having me, first of all. So Datum is a data storage network. And so the infrastructure part that we're building is essentially a decentralized database. The special characteristics are that all data that goes in there is encrypted at source. So if we're talking about your individual data, it's encrypted on your mobile phone, for example, if it's collected there, put into this network in its encrypted state, and that enables secure sharing and or selling of this data. So for each piece of data, we attach some public metadata and also try to attach a value to it. Then on top of this, we're building the Datum app, which is an app you can download on Android and iOS soon. And this is really like your personal data locker. And for us, this is like the first showcase of what kind of services or applications you can build on the infrastructure piece that we're building. So on the tech side, we have the blockchain part, which is basically the public ledger of any data that is being accessed or any data that is being sold or transacted. And then we have the storage part, which is more like a peer-to-peer network of standalone databases, which we cluster together on the application layer. Meaning, so we're building this globally scalable cluster of databases. And the idea is that developers can really just replace things like Google Firebase or the original parse.com. So these are basically database in the cloud services, right? If you're building a mobile app nowadays, you don't want to run your own MySQL and your little PHP part to connect that together. You'll just go to any of the cloud databases. But the problem with that is that the data that is stored in those cloud databases is not secure. It's not stored in an encrypted form, not encrypted individually with your keys. So this data always gets leaked, it gets breached. And then the other thing is on the monetization part of the data, it's actually pretty hard to take data and exchange it and monetize it, right? And so we're trying to provide a standardized way for that. So as a developer, you get a simple to use database. It's globally scaled. In fact, will have much more POPs than something like AWS, right? So they have like 30 data centers around the world, but in our network, we're looking at 10,000s of storage nodes. So you can really control where you need this data to be stored, where it needs to be accessed. So of course, usually as close to your users as possible. And then once your data is in this data storage network, you get all the good stuff that comes out of the box. So for example, you get GDPR compliance because we have all these tools for the data owner to get transparency, what is happening to the data, who is consuming this data, who is accessing this data for how much money. And you, of course, get the option to start making money off this data, right? So you can easily share and sell this data. And we have various mechanisms in our system where the developer can take a cut of the data revenue, but also pass a part of this revenue down to the original data owner. So basically you. And we think this is an important point. So GDPR is this new law in the European Union that hands back some of the data ownership rights to you as an individual, but it doesn't talk about the monetary aspect, right? It doesn't talk what this data is worth. In fact, the only way it talks about money is in the fines that companies have to pay if they leak your data out. And that's a good first step. But actually, we see that many data sets actually have a real concrete value out in the world, right? And with the Datum app, we focus on the advertising sector first. It's already live. You can download it. You can start making money off your email. And yeah, so our hashtag is take back your data, hashtag get paid. And yeah, that's really what we want to do.
Hey, and Roger, walk us through that. So how do you go from there? So I'm, my data is all over the place. There's all kinds of organizations that have medical records on me.
Yeah.
I don't know, maybe even government files on speeding tickets. How do I gather that data up into your app?
Yeah. So what's amazing is that on your mobile phone, there's actually many APIs or interfaces available on the phone to access this data, right? If you think of things like Apple Health Kit, that's already sort of a data bucket that collects and aggregates all your health data. So what we're doing is by making this app for end users, we're getting access to this wealth of data that is accessible through your phone. And if you compare to what is actually accessible through more traditional server-side APIs, there's much more data available to access on the phone because all these apps want to interact, right? They have to work together. So if you're using an app, you have all these buttons like share this through Facebook, or share my Fitbit data down into Apple Health Kit and so on. So we have all this access on your mobile phone. We're able to bring all this data on board. And you're basically able to select under what levels you're comfortable sharing this data, or even selling it to people, and for how much.
Okay,
so you're able to just directly access the data that's already on your mobile phone. So a user can essentially run your app to be able to then connect to those APIs and then onboard that data directly into your application and your network.
Yeah, correct. So that is the first step, right? Where we act like a vacuum machine. You install this app and we pull out data that's already sitting in other apps. In the next step, we really want to pitch our infrastructure as an alternative for developers to other cloud databases, right? And so once that is happening, your data is actually natively sitting as a first-party data source in the Datum network, right? It doesn't hit any other unsecure database. It's directly stored in there. And we're already working with some companies on doing that. So one example I have here is this thing here. This is a smart water bottle or a coffee mug, basically. So this tracks how much water you're drinking on a daily basis, right? And at the moment, this data is just going in a cloud database that they're using, right? And the company, the startup that does this, called the Osmo, a smart water bottle. So they are basically selling this data a little bit, right? But not really at large scale. And you as a user are not cut into this. So what we're working on with them is to ensure that this data goes directly into the Datum network. And once it's in there, you actually take part in the monetization of this data. And they're, for example, selling this data to life insurers already on an aggregated scale, right? So a life insurer wants to know, are people living healthy and how can we keep them alive longer, right? Because if you die, the life insurance has to pay out. The other party that they're sharing this data with is a research organization in the US that does research in kidney stones in young adults. Now, think of it this way, right? Every time you take a sip of water, that's data that is recorded. If it's in your power, right, to share this with this organization, with these researchers that help the people that have this problem, every time you take a sip of water out of this bottle, you're contributing to this pool of data, right? And there's lots of knowledge locked up in this data. So that's really what we want to achieve, right? To try and create these data pools and unlock the value that sits in this data. We're not about locking the data away. We just want to give more ownership and more responsible access to data.
And then you're also using encryption, you mentioned. So that means that the data is actually encrypted so that, if a bad actor for some reason does have access to the data, it's essentially useless to them. So
correct.
You're not going to be able to steal passwords or get in there and steal your water data or whatever it is.
Yeah, and so we call this secure by design. What's wrong with current data stores is it's mostly centralized databases. They're protected by, you can generalize it as a firewall or some sort of, API that sits in front. Now, these systems are always unsecure, right? You've seen this with Equifax. Eventually, this front door gets broken down. There's hackers that basically come from the outside. But even worse, there's government information requests that have access from the backside, right? Forcing companies to disclose this data. Companies are doing various sort of, gray area deals, selling your data off to others. So what we are really doing is we're saying you have to assume that the physical raw storage of the data is always compromised, right? So we're trying to design a system where it doesn't matter if someone gets access to the encrypted data piece, right? They also need to have access to your private key, basically. And that is a much harder thing to do. And if you look at the Equifax example, they lost about 165 million records, right, of Americans because it was all sitting in one database. If you get that one password, right, that accesses this database, all the data is compromised. So in our case, you'd have to crack 165 million keys, right? And, the encryption is similar to the Bitcoin network. So basically, if it's good enough to protect a Bitcoin, it's good enough to protect your data. And even also very important is the transparency of who is accessing this data. So there's a company called Cambridge Analytics, and this was one of the companies that was involved in the data mining and analytics for the Trump campaign and also the Brexit campaign in UK. Now, what they did is they bought a lot of the data sources that are available to advertisers right now, right? There's various kind of large data brokers that sell these data sources of your profile, your segmentation information. And usually this is just used to sell you a car, right? Or sell you other things. But they started buying the same access to these data sources. And in their own words, they claim they have on 80 million Americans, they have a few thousand data points, right, from these data sources. They take this data and put it into 32 psychological profiles. And for these 32 profiles, they created targeted ads and banners to influence your opinion. Now, what's wrong with that is that when you shared this data, maybe you thought, yeah, maybe it's being used to show advertisement to me, right? But I don't think you consented to the fact that this data is then used and turned around to influence your opinion. And that is what we want to solve as well. We want to make it transparent, like who is accessing this data and who should be allowed to buy this data. Maybe you're okay, right, to share your gender and things like that for advertising purposes, and also as long as you get cut into a bit of this data revenue. But maybe you want to say, hey, there's a line I don't want to cross. I don't want my data to be used for political retargeting, right?
Yeah, I was actually one of the journalists who helped break that story. I wasn't the original source, but I published on Medium, and I think it actually is published on Hacker Noon, about how Trump essentially used Cambridge Analytica, which was Robert Mercer, and then Steve Bannon was on the board of directors.
Yeah.
And essentially, in my personal opinion, I think they used Cambridge Analytica and artificial intelligence to help win the election. They were able to target the specific, the specific states that were swing states, and they were able to target propaganda at them. And what a lot of people don't realize is they were also able to target both propaganda from getting Trump supporters to vote, but also discouraging potential Hillary Clinton voters from even going to the poll. In fact, I think that was actually more successful for them, was trying to discourage people who were potentially Democrats to just simply not vote by showing them content, against Hillary Clinton that discouraged them from voting. So it's a fascinating use case of both machine learning, data aggregation, and pulling in all that data and then using it for, a nefarious purpose. I mean, it essentially won him the election. He is president of the United States because he used these tools. So people, a lot of people like to think, technology is magic, but at the same time, it's just data. And data in the wrong hands is a very powerful thing. So, you're building a tool, you're building a solution to be able to take some of that power back so that the user has control over their own data rather than the corporations, rather than the political parties, rather than the Trump administration.
Yeah. And I think what's important to realize is that they had to get the input, the data sources from somewhere, right? And they couldn't go out there and basically say, hey, here's our Cambridge Analytica app, right? Please download this and share your data. So what they did is they tapped into the advertisement market. And an interesting aspect of what GDPR, this new law in the EU, says, which goes live 25th of May this year, is that if you're collecting data, you have to make it transparent to the user for what purposes exactly this data is being used. And if you're collecting data for the purpose of doing advertisements, you can't then later go around and sell this data, to someone to do political retargeting or use it for other purposes, right? If you have not disclosed and gotten the explicit opt-in from users. And so I really think it's going to be interesting how this plays out in the future. Because companies like Cambridge Analytica, they may find it more difficult to get at this first-party data, right? So, for example, if you don't give access to your Facebook account, right, then, no one can get access to this data. But what happens is you're using these free apps, right, Bubble Bash 3 or whatever. You install it, and then it says, oh, please log in with Facebook. And at that point, right, the data gets extracted. And then this company, and these companies don't necessarily doing it, extremely knowingly. Basically, they implement some SDKs from various ad networks and various aggregators. And these SDKs then basically start collecting this data. And a simple example is location-based data. Many weather apps monetize heavily on purely on your location data. So you install this free weather app, and it asks you for location permissions. You're like, yeah, of course, right? Needs to know my location to show me the current weather here. But what really happens is that they start collecting your background location data, and this gets then put into large advertisement networks, into large DSP, DMP platforms, right? Mm-hmm. where basically advertisers buy these audiences. So you can go in there and say, hey, I want to have some people out of Washington State, right, that have been in front of McDonald's a lot and things like that. And that's where this data comes from, right? From you using basically these free services. And I don't think it's clear to people at what scale this is really happening, and also what this data is worth, right? So we're trying to make that more transparent. And there's a lot of push actually from things like GDPR to prevent companies from doing that. But we're basically saying, hey, in some use cases, we still want to make these use cases possible, but we want to make it transparent to you, and we want to cut you into data revenue. And just to give you some example, in the app that you can download now, the Datum app, your email, just opening one email address to our advertisers that use our service so far, it's worth between 50 US cents to $10 US, just you opening one email. And it's really interesting what data is worth. Location data, all your background location data, wherever you have been in 1 month, in the US market, it's only worth 1 US cent to 10 US cents. For a big weather app, that adds up, right? If you have a weather app that has 1 million monthly users, that adds up to a nice amount. But it's interesting from a user perspective to see that, hey, like if I get one email, right, that reaches me, that may be worth $10 US. But all my location history over the whole month, it's only worth maybe 10 US cents. And why? Because this data is aggregated at such large scale already, right, that the prices basically come down massively. And I think that's really fascinating what we start to see now, like, you know, how much is specific data worth? And yeah, I don't think there's you know, lots of information out there on these kind of things. And so we're excited, you know, to launch our full marketplace and to see more of these statistics, right? So what are different data sets worth to which type of data buyers?
You know, I actually downloaded my Facebook data recently, and I was really curious to see what they've actually acquired on me. And one of the things that I was most surprised by was there was a number of photos that were not my photos. So these were photos and screenshots of conversations that other people had had about content that I had perhaps written, or you know, conversations I had had with people, and someone had screenshotted the messenger. So there was all these images in my data, in my Facebook data, that I didn't create. These were other users that created these images, and they had either tagged me or they were somehow associated with me because it was something I had posted, something I had written about, I had maybe commented on it. So, you know, even data that you're not creating is getting aggregated and pulled into your profile. So yeah, it's insane to think about the fact that, you know, even data that you're not creating, data that other people are creating simply on your behalf, and there may be some loose association with you, is associated with your Facebook profile, and you can go actually now download that data. So then that data is actually what creates the valuation for Facebook. What is Facebook? It's a data collection company. That's what they are. That's what they do. That's how they make money. So when you look at the valuation of Facebook, you're actually looking at the value of everyone's data. There is nothing else that values that company. They don't have any services. They, you know, the only thing they do is they have advertising. Obviously they make money from that, but their advertising revenue compared to the actual valuation of the company it's like a tiny fraction of their actual valuation. So, you know, they're doing $240 million, you know, a quarter or a year or whatever in advertising revenue, but the company's worth, you know, billions of dollars.
Yeah.
It doesn't make any sense. The only asset they have is data. So
sure,
you're essentially building an alternative solution that is going to enable people to be able to have control over that data. And as you said, you may get paid $10 for opening an email. You may actually start to get paid for some of your, you know, Fitbit data, your Smart Cup data. And
absolutely,
as more IoT devices go live, and as, you know, we start implementing more of these devices that are tracking all of this data, then you're going to start acquiring more and more data, and there's going to be more and more monetization points as we have more and more smart technology.
And it's really interesting, the dynamics there. So we have a little calculator, calc.datum.org, where we took the annual average revenue per user of Facebook and about 20 or so other social networks and online companies, and just calculate how much are you worth as a user. And it turns out that an average user just from these companies is worth about $2,000 per year, right? And there is other ways you can just look at this, like just think how much you're worth to even just Google, right? If you click on an advertisement in Google search, the average price per click is something like $1, right? If you're a diabetic and you click on a link, it's something like $10, right? Which is highly, so, and arguably for anyone in the US, right? Just from these Google ads, you're probably worth at least a few $100 per year. And then again, for certain groups, like if you're a diabetic, that goes into the thousands, right? And that is just a little sliver, a little fraction of all the data that is being created. And you brought up this data that gets attached to your profile, right? And that's actually an interesting aspect. Like, what about this data that AI creates about you, right? Where they take your base information, like what you like on Facebook, your age, your gender, and so on, and then algorithms create new data off of that, right? And that is actually an area that also needs to be protected in the future. And so again, I talk a lot about GDPR, but I think this is really what's driving a lot of change in the industry. So there's a little known paragraph in GDPR that talks about the right for you to first of all, force a company to make it transparent what AI data was created on you. And secondly, to ask for a review of this data, or even ask for a human review. And this matters in a lot of contexts. Let's say you're a bank, right? Or you give out credit cards or loans, right? And you have an AI that determines the creditworthiness of someone, right? So who's to say that this AI made a fair decision, right? And as we go into this future where it's all about AI and machine learning, right? You may really be classified wrongly by the computer, by the AI, right? And until now, like there's a lot of sites in the US where you can get a credit card online, right? And then you enter your social security number and you get an instant result, right? But in some cases, like if you don't pass that instant check, it's basically game over, right? And you're not going to get a card there. And this is not judged by a human. This is just judged by the computer. So yeah, I think this is a very interesting area. And actually, on our data buyer side, a lot of the talks that we have at the moment, it's also many startups and even large companies, they want to buy data sets to feed into the AI and machine learning algorithms, right? So there's going to be a huge market for this kind of raw data that then gets refined by basically various algorithms. And yeah, so we see a big growth in that market. And it's going to be interesting to see if we can find, responsible ways of handling all of this data.
And can you kind of explain how you're using the blockchain to provide some of this transparency? It's secure.
Sure.
This data, essentially, and ultimately what we're really talking about here is, two things. It's transparency and privacy.
Yeah.
And, essentially you're creating a transparency and privacy management system in a way. So can you kind of talk about how you're using the blockchain to achieve these things?
Sure. Yeah. So first of all, we have this blockchain. In our case, it is a side chain to the Ethereum network, right? So we run our own blockchain. Our token runs on the Ethereum network. We did our token sale and ICO on the Ethereum network. And then basically if you want to participate in the Datum network, you take an amount of this DET token on the Ethereum main chain, and you send it to a pegging smart contract, a smart contract that bridges together the Ethereum mainnet and our side chain, right? So on our side chain, we have various advantages. We use a different consensus mechanism. It's more scalable, it's faster essentially, and cheaper. So on our sidechain, on the Datum blockchain, what we're doing is we're only storing hashes of data. So a hash is you can think of it like an ID of a specific piece of data. And this is really this kind of public ledger, this protocol or log where you can go in and see, oh, so, this is my data and these are the people that access this data or bought access to this data. So this is really the blockchain part. And underlying this blockchain is the peer-to-peer storage level part, right? So so we call these storage nodes, but you can compare this to miners on the Bitcoin network. So it's people that are incentivized, they want to earn some of our DET tokens. And in return for doing that, they have to provide some of their hardware resources to essentially run a little database on their own machine. So that gives us this scale, and your actual data is stored in these databases in this encrypted form. And it's tied to this public log, this blockchain, right? Which basically governs the access to the data and also gives you this transparency over what happened to your data.
Very cool. And you're actually post ICO, so you've already done an ICO, you know, and your product's in development and you're in production, correct?
Yeah, correct. So we have a test network running, right? At the moment, we just run internal storage nodes, right? So you can't become a storage node yet. So that's planned for this summer. But we do have in production already the Datum app that is effectively using this test network. And so I'd say, you know, in general, it's actually the challenge is to launch a public blockchain, right? A permissionless blockchain where you allow anyone to become a node. That is really actually a very hard problem to solve. And that is essentially what's taking time, right? But we didn't want to wait until we had our public blockchain, you know, fully sorted out and launched. Just to enable people to get a first glimpse of how this new data market could work out, right? So basically what's happening at the moment is that this Datum app is storing your information in our test network, right? So we're running 3 nodes at the moment internally. So at the moment, you still have to put a little bit trust in us. Again, your data is encrypted with your private key, so we can't access your data. But for example, what's not good is if we run all the nodes, so someone could come to Datum, right, and say, hey, you guys have to shut down, right? You're doing something that is not right, right? And they could force us to shut down these nodes. So that is why we're really focused on launching a public blockchain, right? So this Datum blockchain, it's not going to be a permission blockchain. It's a public blockchain where anyone can become a node. And that idea is really that we disconnect Datum as a company and as a team, right, from the running and of this blockchain, right? So that we can't also be forced to, for example, shut this down. The way the data is secured, no one can access this data anyway, right? So we also don't have the keys to your data. So that side is already basically secure.
So this is, so ultimately when you launch that component, that's where the decentralization really comes into play.
Correct.
Is once those nodes are live, then that creates, you know, and people have the ability to launch their own nodes. That starts to decentralize the data and really leverage the blockchain to its fullest potential.
Yeah, correct. And that is really, you know, that is really a key component. We're trying to build a public utility, right? It's effectively a decentralized database. And that's the same in the Bitcoin and Ethereum network, right? So there's the Ethereum Foundation, which kind of supports the development, but they don't have the power anymore to shut Ethereum down, right? No one really has. And the same with Bitcoin. And so we are building the same kind of, you know, public utility blockchain that once it's really up and running, like no one can stop it anymore, right? And I think that's really key because actually access to data is very restricted at the moment, right? These companies, Facebook and Google, have vast amounts of really, really interesting data, but they only like to use it for their own purposes. They never give access to raw data. Just imagine the insights that people can get from this data. And very often we hear the craziest things. For example, there's this running and jogging app called Strava, right? It's a fitness tracker. So they collected this data and then this data leaked out, right? So it wasn't secure properly. So someone took this data, aggregated the data and used it to pinpoint locations of US military outposts, right? But they was looking at there is some people running around somewhere in the desert in Afghanistan, right? So that must be some CIA outpost. But the point is, it's really sad nowadays that, you know, the access to data is not more liberal, not more democratic, right? And then we're really excited about that as well, right? To basically give researchers access to this data. And it should be down to you to decide if you want to give this access. And a good example is Apple Health Kit. Apple controls which universities get to do their research, right? That uses Health Kit, right? And they may be a good steward or, you know, they govern this, but, you know, we don't think it should be that centralized. It should be you deciding if you want to share this data, right? And not Apple saying, well, this university is good enough, but this university here from Iran or wherever, right? We don't really think they should be allowed, right, to access the user's health data.
Roger, this is amazing. And I'm one of those that didn't understand data in this realm and how much was being collected on myself and how valuable it was. And I started, as you've been talking, I often think about what a universal income is going to look like in the future. And this looks like part of it. And I don't think it's always going to be one thing. Like we have a system, we've created a system where, you know, people can get rewarded for disposing of their waste. Right. And I always thought, well, that's a piece of a universal income. But what you're saying now is that like all humans have value based on information and data that they create, and we can harvest that data. And then if you think about the most vulnerable among us, and I was in the Ebola outbreak of West Africa, and data and information, it was so scary because we had none. You know, one day the virus was 3 days in the bush, and then you wake up the next night and families across the street were dead. And, you know, the lack of information, like how did it jump so close? So I started thinking, wow, you know, new markets of data. So like say in a viral outbreak like that, data just skyrockets in value among some of the poorest people on the planet. So we could then, you could take like, your model could then go, wow, you know, $2 billion of UN money is going into this small country that's per Liberian, you know, or Cote d'Ivoirian, you know, that's really expensive data to know where they are and what they're doing. So now people in crisis can start earning money based on their data. And wow,
absolutely.
like you have a role in that one as well. Yeah.
And so we have talked or we have mentioned you know, the possibility of these kind of data marketplacing places be, you know, making a contribution to something like a universal income. And I think what's really interesting, what we sometimes get from people is like, hey, the data of someone right somewhere in Central Africa is not going to be worth much, but we actually find that to be very untrue, and actually the opposite, because so if you look at it, what is your data worth if you live in New York, right? And you may maybe get paid $10 US for an email, right? In the context of how much you're earning, that is not, you know, that much. But what we found is we started talking to a company, one of the largest companies that is doing microloans in Africa, right? They have very little data of people, and they want more data to be able to give out more of these loans, right? And so they said, hey, if you have a guy in Central Africa that basically lives almost off the grid, right? But he does have a cell phone. That's what everyone basically has nowadays, right? And so they were saying, hey, the data of that guy may be worth a few US dollars to us, right? Because we're basically giving him a microloan of $100 US. And, you know, if you can give us data on how he behaves, right? And we can determine if he would be, you know, a suitable person to give a loan to, right? That's worth a few US dollars to us. And just think of how much these few US dollars are worth to that person. And what we actually find is that data is worth more in developing countries, right? If you compare to the average income of people. And we have also already talked with, so you mentioned this Ebola outbreak, right? And we have been talking to an organization that is doing something interesting. They're collecting soil samples at farms in Africa. They send these soil samples back to US and analyze them, and then they're able to give these farmers the perfect fertilizer mix. And the fertilizer mix heavily impacts the yield that you get from your field, right? It can be 50 to 100% difference of the yield that you get of your crops. This data is heavily localized, so you need to analyze the soil, you know, of a few square miles or so to really get, you know, the right fertilizer for that specific ground. And at the moment, there is an NGO in the US, right, that is financing this, and they're basically paying off people to go out and collect this data, right? And so that's a good example where, hey, the local farmers can't actually pay, you know, to have this data analyzed and have this data collected, right? But an NGO can, right? And so, yeah, this is also a use case that we're, you know, trying to support in that way, because we want to try and make it easier for these guys, right, to get more people on board to collect this data. So what they do at the moment, they have this whole organization of where, you know, they pay someone at the top, that guy goes to a village, right, and finds some head guy there, and then that guy, you know, may end up, you know, paying some local villagers there, and, you know, realistically even sometimes some kids, right, that go and get some soil sample there, right, and collect that together. But someone needs to administrate that, and that's very, you know, legacy old school nowadays, right? So all this paper and so on. So this is also kind of the sort of data that we want to try to kind of aggregate, right, and unlock the value in that data. And so, yeah, we actually see a huge market in developing countries for this. And you've seen technology leapfrog these developing countries, right? So if you look at China or so, mobile payment is everywhere, right? Because they never really had credit cards. They did have credit card, but just not at, you know, in the mass market penetration. And we think this whole data market idea may actually be something that gets adopted really fast in these more developing markets. And so, you know, we may leapfrog Western markets in this aspect.
No, yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, Trent.
I was just going to ask, so what does the marketplace look like? So, you know, you've got all this data, you know, if you're aggregating all this data, you're a user or a company, what's the buying, selling, what's that process look like?
Yeah, so we're working on a dynamic marketplace, right? Where you can basically set some thresholds, but ultimately the pricing is determined by supply and demand. And to each piece of data, you can either keep this data completely private, but realistically, if you want to sell some piece of data, you have to basically go out there and say, hey, here is, for example, an email, right? So we attach some public metadata to each piece of data if you want to. That gives out this information. Hey, so here's an email, right? And we have certain segmentation information for this email. So like, for example, what are your interests? What are your age? What is your location, right? So the actual data is private, but you're basically putting out here is some, you know, data that I would be willing to sell. And then it's basically up to data buyers to basically make an offer, or you can take part in you know, outstanding data buying requests, right? So advertising networks can go in and say, hey, I'm basically buying any profile from US users that has an email attached, right? Or a phone number or whatever kind of channel to reach you. Could be Google advertising IDs, Facebook ad IDs, Apple device IDs, and so on. So we're still working on launching the first version of this dynamic marketplace. And what's happening in the app at the moment, we're basically just doing this in a manual process, right? So we're going to the advertisers come to us, and we're actually pricing this 50 cents to 10 US dollars. This was kind of decided just in negotiation with the advertisers, and you know, how much are they willing to pay, and so we're kind of, you know, performing this manual kind of negotiation with the advertiser, right? Look, we have this 90,000 users here, right? And you know, we think it would be worth this much. How much are you willing to pay? But ultimately, this is going to be something like an eBay for data, right? Where you can go in as an advertiser, for example, and say, hey, so how many people are in the network that match, you know, this segmentation information or have an email attached, right? And what would be the prices? And then it's up to you to put out a bid, right? To buy this data. And ultimately, we think that similar types of data, right, will be aggregated together, and it almost creates sort of a stock market for certain commoditized types of data, especially things like emails, right, or advertising IDs connected to certain segments.
Wow, Roger. I was sitting here thinking too that one of the big global shifts that I think you could be kind of like influencing is data-driven decisions. And at the individual level, people start to understand that the more data equals better policy, better outcomes. We understand humanity and the human condition better, and it kind of rivals mysticism. Right? The universe just acts in crazy ways sometimes. Like, no. If everyone started thinking that little tiny data points kind of grow into a big picture and then we can make better decisions, that might be the bigger thing that you're onto in shifting humanity's ideas about information. And I think that's just amazing. And I'm excited to live in a world where, you know, data drives everything and data drives decisions. And when humans start understanding that their data is important, and I've left this conversation with a better understanding of how important my data is. And as we're here in the tax season of the United States and everybody's groveling over pennies and dollars, you know, to hear that like perhaps everybody here could be getting a $2,000 raise a year just on their data and taking control of it and pulling that away from these centralized major corporations. I mean, that's shaking, you know, that would really shift economies, and a lot of people would need that. And to think that there's people in, you know, some of our urban areas like Detroit that could immediately start making money, and policymakers could start grabbing data that could help build better solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's often, you know, people look at what we do and they think we're all about locking away the access to data, right? Especially the advertising networks that we're talking to, their initial stance is, well, hey, so this sounds like you're taking data that I'm already collecting now, right? And you're kind of locking it away. But it's actually the contrary, right? We're trying to unlock more access to your personal data, right? There's many things that these ad networks, for example, can't do at the moment, or even the researchers can't touch, right? And so we're actually trying, with your permission, right, and in a transparent manner, to give more access to data. And we really think what's a very important point is to attach this monetary value, or try to attach monetary value to data, right? That's when everyone in the ecosystem has suddenly a strong motive, a strong incentive to start caring about data. And what's interesting is once you get paid for your data as well, you are motivated to provide more and more, accurate data into the system, right? You are basically becoming your own data vacuum by basically making sure, the more data sources I add, right, the more money I could make. And this is really interesting for on the buyer side, right? Because now it's on them to try and aggregate the best data sets available, right? Or for researchers to go out and find all this health data. But as soon as we give you as an individual, as a data source, some money for doing this, right, you almost become, an employee there, and that helps them, right, to aggregate these data sets. And you have an active stake in this ecosystem, yeah.
And so we've talked to a lot of people who are about to launch an ICO. So you're one of the first people on the show who's actually successfully run an ICO. So can you kind of give us some of the details of what that experience was like going through the ICO process, what you raised, how you're allocating those funds now, how you're kind of building and managing your team to actually build, what you've got funded for?
Yeah. So we raised, depends on the Ethereum price currently, right? But I think at current price, we raised about 12 or about 12 to 13 million US dollars. We raised this last year, so it was still kind of in the earlier wave. I think something that we were very focused on is the regulatory aspect, right? So we didn't want to do anything that would not survive later on. And, we weren't primarily focused on, the criminal risk, for example, for us as team and founders. We're more focused on the fact that, hey, if you do things in a way that doesn't comply with various regulations, you may run into these situations where, some governments will come and just shut down some of these ICO projects, right? Freeze the funds that were raised and so on. So we really wanted to make sure that we put this foundation and this whole project just into a context that would survive in the long term. So this took a lot of our energy, and I think so. We started, we did our pre-sale last August, so that was still relatively early, and at that time, it really the regulation situation was very unclear, right? And it has become a bit more clear now, where there's basically more templated approaches. But I think this is still going to be something that we'll see a lot of this year. And there's two things that are critical. One is regulation, and the other thing is actually tax. Right? If you think of it, all of these large amounts of funds have been raised, but there is actually big tax implications, and the tax man just needs 1 year to catch up, right? So we think a lot is going to happen this year, and there's definitely going to be, the projects that are at risk, right? And they may well be shut down. So this was really important to us to do everything in a very transparent way, and also a way, that at that time at least, right, complied with regulations. So for example, we did full KYC, which people didn't really like, right? So know your customer, you had to upload your passport and everything. And if you think of what we are doing, that is something that in the spirit of it went a bit against what we're doing, right? So we're sitting there and saying, hey, now we have to upload your passport. What actually happened is we looked at all the big KYC providers, for example, the company that does it for Coinbase and a lot of the other large exchanges, right? And we looked at, hey, where do you actually store the data and who gets to process this data? And what we found is that mostly what happens is you upload your passport. There's an AI that looks at that, and then it basically goes on the screen of some guy in some outsourced, almost like a call center type thing, right? And a lot of these places are usually in Southeast Asia. So if you're basically joining Coinbase, and that, this is it may be that your passport, shows up on the screen somewhere in India, right? And there is a guy basically handing your information. So we actually decided to build our own KYC process, our own interface, right, where people could upload it, so that we could ensure that, we had full control over this data, very sensitive data that we collected. of the people that joined our tokens. This took a lot of our energy. It's frankly not something I would recommend, other ICOs to do unless they really have the motivation and, the technical resources also to do this, right? It's a bit insane building your own KYC system when you can just take something out of the box. But that's something that was really important to us, and it's something that we did, and I think it's something that the community appreciated. So use of proceeds of the ICO, right? This is something we are also really concerned about. And in fact, in a few weeks, we'll release our first transparency report, which gives you it's like a balance sheet or basically, an audit and an account of what we have done so far, how much money we have spent, what is left, right? How was this money spent with regards to different allocations or budget that we had planned. And this is something we have so far seen, very, very few ICOs do. And because there is not much regulations, ICOs can raise these funds and use it for any purpose, right? And of course, I don't know how much the public outside of the ICO circle really gets to know this, but of course there is many ICOs that raise money and then they fly first class to the next conference, and there's all these presidential suites, right, full of these guys that just did an ICO. Yeah, so we took a very startup normal type approach, right? So the funds that we raised, so they are very valuable, right? They allow us to build this product, but they also need to be treated with care and respect, right? And it's not just money that you can take and then you bugger off to Vegas and spend it there. And so again, it's something I think we'll see this year, right? There have been a few, probably thousands of ICOs happening now. And of course, there is some there, they probably just raised money and they will have spent it by this year and they will shut down. In fact, there's like 5 to 10 where this already happened, right? So it's just like, maybe it was a scam from the get-go. They just raised money, then they shut down their website afterwards. And it's like, so what happened? So I think, this is going to be interesting, what plays out this year. So we're taking the approach. We want to be as transparent as possible and basically show people just like a normal startup, right? This is the progress we're making. This is how we're spending funds. These are the things that we're spending the funds on. I do think, it's the opportunity to raise funds, right? That is really kind of, that's enabling at the moment the development of this technology. And it's a little bit different from traditional other tech startups because blockchain is actually really, really complicated. If you think of it as a platform to build on, it's the worst programming environment in the world, right? It's super slow. Every time you call a function, you have to pay money for it. So it's really horrible to build things on it. But the decentralization aspect is really powerful, right? And it enables this huge paradigm shift in how we approach things and who is in control of stuff, right? So for us, for example, we really want to make this happen, but it does actually require quite a lot of funds just to build out the tech stack. And so I think personally, what I'm not really keen on is seeing now, right, that ICO or token sale is basically just attached to any buzzword and people are just raising money and they don't really have a clear plan of how they're actually using blockchain and what are they contributing to the blockchain ecosystem, as a whole, right? Really working on the difficult problems. And because arguably you don't really need, $10 million US in seed funding, because let's face it, this is actually seed funding, right? This is not like, round Series A or B money. And so originally these funds were really supposed to give, teams enough money to really work on these difficult challenges, right? Really, build out new blockchains, introduce new mechanisms of consensus and so on. And I think some projects that are raising now, they have no intention of doing any of that, right? And so the money that comes in, it's really not justified, right? They don't really need that much money. But anyway, we'll see. Personally, I think eventually this has to come to an end because investors ultimately will focus on value again. And what value has been created. And if you look at the valuation of ICOs at the moment, it's purely based on speculation, right? The market caps of some of these projects is extreme, right? In the billions, even without a product. Ultimately, these projects will have to prove that, hey, So we have a first product here. This is how much revenue or transaction volume is going through this now. And this is how it's growing, right? Every month we're growing by 10%, usual startup metrics. And so there is a story there, how we can, build this into something that should be worth a few billions, right? But at the moment, hardly any project really has that. And ultimately the market is going to look at that and come down back to that. So, last few days market has come down again. We don't actually focus, for example, on our token price. This is purely based on speculation at the moment, right? We focus on the long term, on actually growing the transaction volume, even in our little test network, because ultimately that's what's going to drive the price of the utility token, right? How much is this utility being used? And so we're very focused on the very simple KPIs and metrics, like what is the transaction volume right now, right? How many data buyers are actually, for example, buying these emails, are buying our users' location data, trying to grow that, at least 10% growth every month, right? Which is the basic startup thing. If you can, hit that, you're in a good place, right, for future growth. And I'm not seeing that enough from, many other projects. So that's really something I think is going to be key in the future.
Well, it sounds like you've got a proficient development team. And you even what you put into your ICO, building your own, verification and authentication system for, the people who participated in your ICO. A lot of ICOs won't go to that length. I imagine that was quite the development project. So the fact that you could even build that just proved that, you've got the development skill set within your team to be able to build what you're actually pitching here.
Yeah, and so we are 18 people at the moment, right? And this is, this is a new world, right? The whole cryptocurrency and blockchain space, and so this is the size of team that you need even to just build out, your basic MVP, your minimum viable product. If you look at a normal startup, usually you don't need 18 people, right? You're basically a few, right? Maybe 5 people or so, right? And you build out your MVP, you get a little bit seed funding and then go from there. This is also a very fascinating thing in the space at the moment. It's pretty hard to find new talent, right? Because there is so many projects out there that are so well funded, right? So if you're like a computer science fresh grad or something like that, right, blockchain may be a good thing to look at, right? I think there's lots of opportunities in this space.
No, absolutely. Hey, Roger, I'm telling you, you seem like somebody, or you've proven that you practice what you preach, which is a good indicator of somebody who gets it and understands. And then the follow through after an ICO. We had a good meeting with our advisors and they really stress that. They're like, raising money, we've got that handled. It's getting through, keeping that engagement with the investors and continuing on through. So you seem to understand what homework you have ahead of you.
And I would, you mentioned community, right? And this is one of the fascinating things is that basically you're decentralizing the ownership of this company, right? Or this product as well. And so in our case, we had over 2,750 people, right, that participated in our token sale. And we had some interesting dynamics that there was a one guy that messaged me once, right, and said, hey, Roger, so the minimum buy-in you have is like $50 roughly equivalent worth, right, of tokens that you could buy. That was our minimum level because we actually were checking these KYC things manually. So we had to, set some limit. So we said $50. And the guy's like, hey, but I only have $30, right? That's all I have, but I still want to participate. And so we had a lot of people that participated with very small amounts. And that's, very empowering as an entrepreneur to see, that you're really giving a chance to anyone really to partake in this, and believe in this and support this vision. And then, if it works out, also, reap some benefits from it later on. And this is something that in the startup world, this is why, many times it's been said, okay, these ICOs can disrupt traditional VC venture capital, right, and seed funding. And I really believe it does, right? Because traditional funding, it's very opaque, and there is hardly any exits or liquidity in this market. So it's hard to get access to this market to invest in startups that you believe in. And you can basically, you only get access when the company goes public, right? And that happens very rarely. And this is the fascinating thing with tokens and cryptocurrency, right? In most ICOs, you immediately have a liquid market as soon as they get listed on an exchange. And then it's really down to the market to, establish, hey, is this a good project or not? And anyone can buy in at any time, and anyone can exit at any time. And frankly, this also creates very interesting problems, even with our employees, right? So our team, of course, there's team tokens, right? So team members get team tokens. We decided not to do, heavy lockup and restrictions on that. So it's down to employees to make their own financial decisions. And the vast majority of the team has not, sold any tokens at all. But of course, there is always one person who makes his own decisions like, hey, I have these tokens, they're worth something, so I'm out, right? I'm still working for this company, but I basically said, like, I don't believe, you have an upside to it. It's fascinating what kind of, problems and dynamics, this creates. And I think, again, this year, there's going to be a lot of stories around team tokens, right? And what happened to founders and so on. And it's a difficult problem to solve, right? If you give someone these tokens in a startup, you give people equity. It's not worth anything. You have to work first to create value, and you can't sell the equity. You have to wait for an exit opportunity, right? And with tokens, it's different, right? You give people tokens and it's immediately liquid. So it has its own dynamics. And we've been started to talk to some other successful blockchain projects, and so no one really has found a good, kind of framework. How do we do this compensation of team? How do we incentivize employees, and how do we align it with the interest of the project on a larger scale?
You're talking close to home, man. We're going through those nightly. Those are the conversations, decisions we have with our advisors, and how to create our token economy and things like that. So yeah. We're not alone. Well, great, man. Hey, thanks for coming on the show. Really appreciate it, man. I feel smarter. And tell everybody how they can get a hold of you.
So first of all, our website, datum.org. We've got a large Telegram group, so t.me/Datum Network. And then you can also follow our blog, so blog.datum.org. You can shoot me an email, roger@datum.org. I try to answer most emails. If you don't get any response from my email, you can write to hello@datum.org. And we have our community team on that, and they may be able to get messages to me.
All right. Well, great. Well, thanks again.
Thanks for being on the show.
Guys. Thanks for having me. Have a good day.
All right.